Hello, I'm honored today to be here with Peter Sagal. Most of you will recognize his voice, even if you don't know his face. He is the longtime host of the NPR quiz show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. And he's joining me today to talk about his uncle, Ted Scholnick, who recently left the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation a large bequest. We didn't really know Ted, so we're eager to learn more through our conversation with Peter today. So thank you, Peter.
My pleasure. It's really sort of a pleasure, an unexpected pleasure to be here talking to you.
I know that you were close to your Uncle Ted, and so I have some questions about him, and I'm hoping we can begin there, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
That's great. So if you could just tell me a little bit about your uncle and what he did for a living so that our audience will understand.
Yeah, so and this is all relevant, am one of three sons in my family. And from our very earliest days, all of us, my two brothers and myself, Doug and Roger, were always very close to our uncle. He was our mother's only sibling. And and this is relevant, I think, to the conversation, never married. So from our earliest memories, he was always a combination fourth brother, second father. We were always very close to him. And he was significantly younger than my mother by a few years. So he was always, just this cool uncle. We all have very vivid memories of going on trips with him when he was a young man and we were much smaller, and driving around in a sports car, and he was always utterly beloved. He always brought the best toys to play with and knew the best places to go. And as we grew up, that relationship continued. He ended up taking over his father's business, that is my grandfather's business, which was a small community grocery store in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge residents of a certain age might remember the Evergood Market on Mass Ave between Porter and Harvard Squares. That was our family business. It was owned by our family, purchased by my grandfather in 1949, and we kept it in the family until my uncle sold the business in 1999. So he was this odd guy, really fun, fascinating, adventurous spirit who was a grocer. All of my brothers all worked for him during our growing up. That was the job I'm most proudest of ever having, stamping cans. I'm old enough to remember when we stamped them. When I was that young. And my uncle retired in 1999, lived another, well, as it turns out, a little more than 20 years, and ended up having a wonderful relationship with a woman named Linda, who just predeceased him before he died last May, right before what would have been his 80th birthday. And what's interesting is, even though we were very, very close, as close as I think you can be to an uncle, I didn't know until I was well into my late 20s that my uncle had what I understand is now called Crohn's disease, and had dealt with it his entire life, including having an ileostomy when he was in high school, the age of 16 or 17, I'm not quite certain. That, I'm pretty sure, had something to do with the fact that he always seemed at more ease with us children when we were children than he seemed to be around other adults, and might have something to do with the fact that despite his charm and his good looks and his spirit, he never married. And it was fascinating for me, because even though I found out about it from his mother, my grandmother, before she died, and heard some of the story, he still never discussed it with us. It was just something, it went from something we didn't know about to something we did know about that we'd never discussed. And let me put it this way. When he did pass away and he left a very large bequest, we were a little surprised because we had no idea that he had accumulated enough money to give a little bequest. But that bequest to your foundation was really the first thing he had ever done to admit, be open about the illness he had struggled with his whole life.
Yeah, it's not incredibly unusual, really. These are unfortunately diseases that people often hide and don't talk about, and we hear all too often that people have kept their struggle, their suffering to themselves. So it's unfortunately not unusual.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's been my understanding. And what's been interesting to me is just how little I knew about what he was going through. Interesting maybe is the wrong word. I obviously he suffered from it physically and perhaps emotionally. And as close as we were, he never felt comfortable with discussing it with us. And that kind of makes me sad, but well, it makes me very sad. Doesn't no if and or but about it. But it's my hope that with his gift and the subsequent connection with you guys, there might be some possibility of helping other people, particularly young people, of dealing with this a little bit better, or at the very least, knowing they're not alone. To my knowledge, my uncle never, prior to his death, got involved with any efforts such as your foundations or anything else. He never, to my knowledge, reached out to other people living with this condition for support. And I think that's sad. I think he would have benefited from that. And I would guess that part of the spirit behind his bequest, which again, he never mentioned to us before we found out about it in the will, was in the hope that you folks might be able to help other people dealing with what he dealt with his whole life.
Yes, I'm sure, not having known him, I'm sure that was part of his thinking, and we so appreciate it. Part of our work, an important part of our work, is to destigmatize the diseases and to help people recognize that they aren't alone, and to use our resources and our programs to engage people that are struggling with the diseases, because we also know through surveys and a lot of analysis that the more people are engaged with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, the more they're aware of what exists, have the emotional support and the education to help them, the better their outcomes are. They have a better disease journey the more they're engaged with us and information broadly about the diseases. So
Yeah.
I know for sure that your uncle's gift will go a long way to help people who are struggling now and in the future.
Well, I think if that's the case, I think that would be a befitting legacy for him. As I said, he had no children of his own. So if his legacy in the world can be somehow helping other people dealing with what he dealt with a little better than he was able to deal with it, then I think that would be a wonderful memorial to him.
Yeah, that's great. So tell us a little bit more about Ted, though, if you could. I'd just love to hear what kinds of activities did he enjoy? What were the things that gave him joy?
When he was younger, he loved sports cars. He loved bicycling. He loved all kinds of physical activities. He was, and I say this as a professional humorist, he was much funnier than I am. He had an amazingly incisive wit. He was extraordinarily smart. He's the only person I've never been able to beat in Trivial Pursuit. He really just had an immense amount of charm, which and was extraordinarily fun and extraordinarily generous and always up for an adventure. He was the kind of guy who was never satisfied just to sit around the house and stare at a television. He always wanted to go out and do something, especially with us. And again, I refer to the fact that I think he felt more at ease with us as children, and then eventually as we became adults, because we had that basis, than he did with other adults. Although at the same time, we did hear from his many friends that he had as a young man, as an unmarried person, which he was, of course, for many years, and his single days back in the 70s and 80s. We also heard when he died from a woman who of a similar age, who had been his most serious relationship back in his life until he met his life partner, Linda, much later on, a woman named Beverly. She got in touch when she found out he had died. We hadn't seen her since, gosh, the late 70s. And she just loved him, I think, in the literal sense, but she couldn't get him, oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, given what I know now, to commit to a marriage. He seemed reticent, and we can guess why. And so she had to move on and live her life elsewhere with other people. But man, she loved him too. We just had a conversation about just how great he was. The stories that we were able to tell at his memorial were, I don't know, the kind of things that you'd want to be told at yours. Let me just say that. His generosity and his humor and his spirit and his kindness. I've heard from people who worked for him over the many years he ran that small grocery store. They all loved him as a wonderful boss, as somebody who never asked anybody to do anything that he wouldn't do. He worked incredibly hard. He was kind. He was supportive. during his illnesses, every now and then his illness would flare up and he'd have to go to the hospital for whatever reason, technical things I don't understand. What was amazing was how his long-term employees, and he had a lot, would just rise to the occasion and support the business and put in the extra hours and take over the extra duties so as to make sure the business would be healthy when he got back to it. And I don't think that happens by accident. I think that happens by just inspiring people to loyalty, with your loyalty to them. Really, he was, and I mean, this is what makes me so sad about his situation. Because I think that if it hadn't been, and I don't mean this in the physical sense, I mean this in the emotional sense, if he hadn't been held back by his illness, I think Lord knows what other opportunities and horizons he might have crossed over, because he had an amazing amount of potential. But I think he held himself back out of maybe here's something you can help me with, better understanding. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you all. I mean, is it shame? Is it a physical circumstance that there are certain things he didn't feel he could do? I mean, for example, until later in his life, he very rarely traveled, even though he had he had the resources and freedom to do it. That might have had something to do with being very afraid of being in a situation where he couldn't take care of himself in a way that he felt necessary. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But again, like I said, I don't think I would be as interested in helping you continue the work that you do with his benefit if I wasn't so aware that there was a cost to him. And I don't think anybody else of his potential and his grace and kindness and intelligence should be held back in the way that he might have been.
Yeah. So first of all, Peter, I feel like we have such a good sense for your uncle right now, and that's wonderful. You've done him a great tribute by describing this really smart, thoughtful, joyful man, and that's terrific for me and all the listeners. What I would say is that I'm encouraged to hear that it certainly didn't hold him back from all kinds of activities, which, yes, on the one hand, which is wonderful. We certainly have patients for whom the disease and the symptoms and the entire journey disrupts everything about their lives. And that is truly sad. On the other hand, you're describing a man who maybe didn't engage in all the things he would have been capable of or maybe wanted to. And there's a lot of supposition on my part here, but yeah, what I would say is that it is not unusual for people in our community to struggle with a lot of emotional turmoil and body image issues and self-esteem, and mental health is really a challenge in our community. A lot of our patients truly suffer from post-traumatic stress, and that can get in the way of choices that they make. This worry that at any moment the disease is going to flare. These are diseases that relapse and remit throughout the journey, and sometimes without a lot of notice. So that can really make a person very concerned about endeavoring to do things which they might otherwise have done if they didn't have these diseases. So
yeah. And again, I should say that, you know, in his honor and out of respect to his memory, this is all supposition on my part. I don't, because he never spoke about it. Mm-hmm. I don't know what held him back from, say, marrying that lovely woman many, many years ago, or traveling more, all those other things. It's all supposition. And I wish he never would have, but I do wish we would have had a chance to talk about it just so I could have understood him a little better.
Yeah, well, I'll just use this opportunity, and I'll probably say it several times. You're bringing a lot of awareness just by having this conversation with me. And so I'm so grateful, because you're doing a beautiful thing in his memory. And maybe these things, unfortunately, weren't true for him, but his bequest in your time can help change that for other people. And that's,
well, I hope so. Well, let me, if I may, you know, because we were never able to discuss it, I honestly don't know a lot about what he suffered. This is what I know, and it's all been gathered. Really, I mean, oddly enough, for example, I only heard about the procedure he had. I believe it's called an ileostomy. Mm-hmm. When he was in high school, the night of his memorial service. We had never discussed it. I knew it had happened, but I didn't know why. And my understanding, and here's where I turn to you for some expertise, is that with his disease, which I now understand is now called Crohn's disease, but when he was dealing with it, and this would have been in the early to mid 50s, was called ileitis. It's an inflammation or something wrong. I didn't go to medical school, much to my mother's disappointment, with the large intestine, right? And that's all I know. And I know, again, from this conversation we had, it was actually with my mother, who died subsequently shortly thereafter, that one of the problems is that you can't control your bowels, which can be extraordinarily disconcerting and embarrassing, especially, and here's where, it just becomes so heartbreaking, to an adolescent. When you're so conscious of your body and so conscious of other people's opinions of him. And I just can't imagine the torment he went through dealing with that in the context of like going to high school or earlier. I have no idea when the condition started. I know that the procedure happened when he was in high school. So what can you tell me about what it's like and what causes it and what its I don't know, what's the word, symptoms are?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that we're an organization, the name of our organization is Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. So we address both diseases, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. They are related diseases. They are similar in nature. They both fall broadly under this umbrella called inflammatory bowel disease.
Right.
These are painful and at the moment, medically incurable diseases, and they attack your digestive system. And we like to say it can happen, certainly Crohn's disease can happen anywhere along your digestive tract, from mouth to anus. We like to say from gums to bum. Ulcerative colitis, on the other hand, only attacks your large intestine, your colon. So I don't know which part of his digestive tract was diseased, and it could have been several parts of his digestive tract, but for him to have had ostomy surgery and then have an ostomy bag for the rest of his life, there was clearly damaged and diseased sections of his intestines and maybe even his entire large colon that was removed so that he would be able to collect waste through a bag. And
Right.
As you point out, that is a traumatic experience for anyone. It is certainly a traumatic experience for a teenager. It would have been woefully misunderstood in the 50s. He would easily not have known anybody else in the world who had any such condition. So you could imagine feeling very alone in that situation and self-conscious, all the things that you're talking about. But what leads up to it, and even though he had ostomy surgery, as you've pointed out, he continued to have symptoms later in life. So it didn't fix his disease, right? He still had Crohn's disease despite this major surgery and life-altering device that he then carried with him for the rest of his life. Our patients, they experience all kinds of symptoms. So persistent diarrhea, as you've pointed out, rectal bleeding, abdominal pain, fever, weight loss. But some of our patients also, and those are all things that are happening in your intestines, in your digestive tract, excuse me. But some of our patients have what we call extra-intestinal symptoms. So anything from joint pain or skin conditions, bone, kidney, liver issues, issues with your eyes. So it can manifest itself in many different ways and cause pain and suffering in a variety of ways, unfortunately.
Is it, here's, again, I reveal my ignorance. Is it an infectious disease? Do you catch it? Is it a genetic disease? Is it just sort of a chronic condition that some people are unlucky enough to be born with and develop at a certain point? I have no idea.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. You cannot catch the disease. We recognize that there is a genetic component to the disease, meaning that everyone who has Crohn's or colitis is genetically predisposed to it, but lots of us are genetically predisposed and will never develop Crohn's or colitis. So we recognize that this genetic predisposition is interacting with something else, and that something else is typically environmental. We don't fully understand what in the environment is triggering the disease, but we recognize that it is a change in your microbiome. So all the bacteria and fungi and viruses that live inside your gut, that microbiome is altered in a way. It also is not a healthy, balanced microbiome. So it is some confluence of these issues of being genetically predisposed, not having the right microbiome. There's some kind of environmental trigger, stress, a virus you catch, bad diet and nutrition. When they come together, it creates this onset of either Crohn's or colitis.
Right. And so it's a variety of unlucky draws for anybody who has it. It's just a certain genetic component and circumstances which are not specifically understood. So my guess is, from what you're saying, is that there is no, at least at this point, no way of preventing it from happening. You've already mentioned there's no cure.
That's correct. Both are true. And it's an important focus of our research efforts here at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation to both more deeply understand the causes of the disease in order to develop treatments to help on that journey, ultimately cures, but also to figure out ways to potentially prevent the disease.
Right, right. And again, as you know, asking from ignorance, which I wish it wasn't so deep. In the time of my uncle's youth, back in the 50s, it seems, just by deduction, that the only way they could treat it and prevent that, uncontrollable bowel movements was to remove some portion of his lower intestine. We don't know because, again, he didn't talk about it, and instead do a bypass to an exterior ostomy bag, right? Mm-hmm. Is that still the primary treatment for this, or have we developed in the decades since some less invasive or difficult way of dealing with it?
Yeah, the wonderful news is that the last 2 decades, we've seen incredible advancements in treatments. And there's a wonderful armamentarium of drugs that are on the market right now to treat these diseases. They do not by any means, they certainly don't cure the disease. There's certainly a ton of still unmet patient need. These drugs don't work for everyone. They certainly don't always work for the long term, but they have changed the course of the disease pretty dramatically for patients. Most of those drugs fall into a category of biologic treatments. And those biologics, which are different from a chemical compound, because biologics essentially are made up of living cells. Those biologics, of which there are now many, can really put the disease for many into remission. And what happens when patients go into remission is that it often stops the inflammation that's happening in your gut, and that inflammation is dangerous. Your uncle probably had an enormous amount of inflammation and damage to his intestines, and that's why surgery is required to remove it. So the fact that these drugs are on the market and people are taking them earlier and earlier in their disease journey, which is preventing long-term damage, can often prevent surgery entirely from happening. Right. So that's the wonderful news.
That is extraordinarily good news. So can I ask, do you have a sense of in how many cases these days, given the advancements you've mentioned, what percentage of cases is surgery necessary now? Assuming it was 100% back in my uncle's youth, that either that or just suffer with it. What's the percentage now?
What we do know, the percentages that we have are that 70% of Crohn's patients will have surgery at some time in their journey. But that surgery can look like lots of different things at this point. And it doesn't, and the large majority of the time does not require ostomy surgery or the use of an ostomy bag. But it can be a resection where the surgeon is able to remove just the diseased portion of the intestine and then reconnect the rest of it, and doesn't necessitate an ostomy. So 70% of Crohn's patients, about 30 or 35% of ulcerative colitis patients still need surgery. But even in the surgery world, the amount of progress that's been made in the last 2 decades, understanding when to have surgery, what's needed, surgical procedures, have aided dramatically in healing parts of the gut and creating better quality of life for patients without necessitating an ostomy. Now, there are still some patients who, because of the condition of their intestines, do have to go all the way to that dramatic step. But more often than not, that's not required anymore.
Let me ask you about that, only because, again, I'm kind of curious. Well, curious is not quite the right word. Because he wouldn't talk about it, because it wasn't discussed, I don't know what my uncle dealt with on a daily basis. So I'm just going to ask you some basic questions.
Sure.
Like, so he had an ostomy bag. I know that. And my assumption about that, and you can correct me, is that the bag was attached somehow through a strap, whatever, to his side of his abdomen. And throughout the day, his waste drained into it, right? Without any, effort, or it was a passive sort of system. It just collected.
Yep.
And then at certain times every day, he had to empty it, right? And so all that's true. What else is involved for somebody? Does he have to regularly clean the incision? Does it require regular visits to a doctor? I have no idea. I mean, if you can speculate, because we don't know what his daily life was dealing with this, I'd be grateful.
Yeah. I would say my guess is that your uncle was dealing with two large buckets of issues throughout his disease journey. One was caring for his ostomy bag, which is not a small amount of work. And he would probably have had to empty it fairly regularly.
Again, 2-3 times a day, 5 times a day, 10 times a day?
Probably more like 5 to 10 times a day. And a lot of our patients are often concerned about leakage and the bag overfilling. And so the amount of time and effort and concern that it brings is not insignificant. A lot of our patients develop skin conditions. And so there can be skin conditions as a result of it. Dehydration can be an issue because you're not always clear about how much fluid you're losing on a regular basis, and maintaining proper fluids when you have a bag and the proper electrolytes can be an issue. So there are issues of managing, maintaining the bag and everything the bag means, but it didn't cure your uncle of his Crohn's disease. So he also still had Crohn's, right? And there could have been inflammation in other parts of his intestines and pain that was coming as a result of that inflammation. So he could have been dealing with inflammation, pain, fevers. He may have even had what I referenced earlier as extra intestinal issues that were coming about because of his inflammatory bowel disease. So, and he probably would not be able to predict those things well from week to week or month to month. Whereas the ostomy stuff, I suspect he got very good at managing and understanding because he had it for so many years. That may have been something he was able to predict and manage more consistently and regularly, but he was probably dealing with both issues throughout his life.
That all makes sense, just looking back on my experience of it, the times he would disappear for a long time to visit the restroom, the times where he would have to go into the hospital. And when we were young, we were just told, well, Uncle Ted is sick. He's in the hospital. Well, he's just dealing with some stuff we didn't know. Obviously, flare-ups of his Crohn's. And I believe that at certain times he had to have surgery. Does it affect what you can eat and drink? Because I never noticed that with my uncle. He never seemed, like, oh, I can't have that. I can't eat this. This is bad for me.
It does vary from patient to patient, but you definitely have to be cognizant of it for the reason I shared earlier, which is that getting the proper electrolytes, understanding dehydration is a really critical component. Right. So people have to be very conscious of what they're ingesting in order to care for their body's nutritional needs, while recognizing that this device is, happening.
Right. And my understanding of that is just on a basic common sense level, again, not a doctor, is that if you lose X amount of your lower intestine, say, that's X amount of of tissue that's not there to absorb nutrients and fluids as they work in a healthy person.
That's exactly right, Peter. Yep.
So
Well said. I couldn't have said it better.
So you have
Definitely.
to make up for that by either taking extra or avoiding certain things or monitoring certain conditions, blood sugar. I have no idea, but that's a
Right.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I will use this opportunity just to say, so we run a program that we call IBD Ventures. This is our venture philanthropy effort inside of our research program. And what it does is it allows us to invest in commercial entities, biotechs and small pharma companies and device companies that are developing new products for patients. So on our quest for cures, we are also trying to help advance discoveries that will improve people's quality of life in the moment. And one of the investments we're making right now is a company called 11 Health. And they are in the process of developing what we would call a smart ostomy bag. There hasn't been a lot of progress in ostomy bags over the last 40 or 50 years. But this is an effort to design something that is intelligent in terms of measuring the hydration in your system, understanding what your electrolyte levels are like, recognizing whether there is skin irritation or infection that's starting to develop, and then have that data and information flow continuously or regularly to a smart device. This would be a huge advancement for all patients that have ostomies because it would bring a really necessary tool to them for understanding and monitoring how well their ostomy is functioning.
Right. So your phone presumably would tell you, communication with a smart device, that it would tell you your, as you say, your electrolyte levels, your fluid levels, things you have to adjust, things you have to worry about. That would be cool, I guess, to have your bag talk to you.
Exactly.
That sounds good. I want to know more about what you guys are doing. But the one thing I'm specifically interested in, for the reasons that I think should be clear at this point in the conversation, is to what extent you are helping people, especially young people, thinking of my uncle as a young man, just deal with the emotional weight that they carry along with their ostomy bags or any other symptoms of this condition.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because first, it gives me an opportunity to remind the audience that these are diseases that affect people of all ages. The large majority of our patients are diagnosed sometime between the ages of 15 and 35. And so it is often, like with your uncle, a disease that begins early in a person's life. So our mission has two core components. One is to invest in research that will improve patients' lives and ultimately get to cures. And the other is to help improve their quality of life throughout the journey, both children and adults. And so we do that by educating patients and caregivers and healthcare professionals. We do it by advocating for important public policy, but we also do it by providing emotional support. And we do that in a variety of ways. We have pediatric specific support groups all across the country. We have online support communities. And for our pediatric patients, we run a camp program in the summer called Camp Oasis. It's in 11 different locations across the country, and it's designed exclusively for kids with either Crohn's or colitis. So they are sometimes, for the first time, surrounded by people who know exactly what they're going through. We hear regularly through surveys and letters and feedback that this is a life-altering experience for a lot of our patients because it's the first time they really are getting that kind of emotional support and not feeling alone and recognizing there are other people with this condition. And it can help really set them on a better course. So these are the things that are important to us.
Yeah, I have no idea because, again, he didn't talk about it, but my sense of my uncle was that he felt very isolated. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I mean, you had never heard from him before. Mm-hmm. So my guess is that he never got involved in any way in organizations like yours or groups like yours or anything. And I can only guess that he would have benefited from it. So that's a good thing.
Peter, Did he ever actually sit you down to tell you about his ostomy
Never,
surgery in his
not
bag,
once,
or
not
how
once.
did you find out about it? I'm just curious.
So I made it a point to go and visit with my grandmother, Rose Weinstein Skolnick, and just get her biography, which was a great day. And I learned so much about her life. And at the end of that conversation, we turned to her experience as a mother, and that ended up being a conversation about my mother, her oldest daughter, or her oldest child. And then finally, we got to the subject of Ted. And I remember so vividly her manner changing and her becoming really sad, because she felt, as a mother might, that this had really held him back. He was, I mean, as I've described to you, his character, I mean, I think they believed that a boy, even of that charm and ability, would have gone really far in life. I don't think, for example, it was anybody's plan, either my grandfather or my uncle's, that my uncle would succeed him in the family business. I think they hoped, in the way of many immigrant families, that he would surpass that and go on to a professional career of some kind, and that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And so I just remember my grandmother saying, and I remember this phrase so vividly, she said, "It's just that damned," did she say damned? It would have been out of character for her. Mm-hmm. She might have said something along those, "It's just that damned bag he has." And again, whether or not this is true, she felt that was what was held him back. And I remember that because that's when I found out about it. And I was 28, right? I've known him for my whole life, never had any idea. That's when I found out about it. Yeah. And again, from that moment to the day he died, I never, ever, ever had a conversation with him about it. I never brought it up. He never mentioned it. After he died, we went to his apartment to clean it up, to get it ready to sale. And I found his box of medical supplies, bags and other, sterile things. And that is literally the first time I ever saw that.
Wow.
So,
yeah.
I mean, so it was all a mystery to me. This is why I have so many questions for you. I was never able to ask him directly about this at all. So yeah. And I mean, he couldn't have kept it a secret from his partner in his last 20 years, because you just don't do that. But no. And I'm going to say this. I think, I have no idea. Again, never discussed it with him or with her, to whom I was also very close, Linda McIntosh. I think it must have been an extraordinary act of courage. He had been single for a very long time. He was approaching 60 years old. And I think he must have made a decision that if he did not want to spend the rest of his life alone, he needed to confront this and be open about it with somebody. I never had a chance, and never will, to talk to him about if he ever had that conversation with Linda. He must have, at a certain point, to explain, I need to tell you something about myself. Mm-hmm. But even talking about it now, I'm getting kind of emotional, because knowing him as I did and how reticent he was, it must have been an extraordinary act of courage for him to do it. Even if it seems like no big deal, perhaps to other people listening, for him, it was a huge deal. And by taking that step, by being open about it, he got for himself what he had deserved his whole life, which was an intimate and rewarding relationship with somebody who loved him just as much as we all did.
Yeah, and I think it's such a good way to describe it. I don't think anyone who either has an ostomy bag or has a dear loved one that has one would disagree that even the most comfortable person still has to access courage to reveal it, to help other people understand it. And I have heard way too often, more times than I can count, and I'm sad to share it with you, people who rule out intimate relationships because of the symptoms and the condition. And many times that's because of an ostomy, but it can be a wide variety of things about this disease that make some people shut off the idea of having an intimate relationship, being sexual. And that's changing all the time. It is so much better than when your uncle was a young person, but we still have a lot of work to do in that regard to help our patients understand that all those things are possible for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that occurs to me, and it's funny because there's a weird crossover to my career, is on my radio show, we do a lot of poop jokes and fart jokes. And the reason we do that, and the reason to whatever extent we're successful, is because people are weird about poop. You know, we're just all weirdly nervous about it. And that takes more psychology than I will ever understand. So yeah, it just seems grossly, I guess, unfair that in addition to whatever people have to deal with just managing this condition, they have to deal with their own shame and the general societal decision that poop is embarrassing and gross, and we don't talk about it, and we certainly don't, let it come up in daily lives. Yep. I mean, that's the one, if we do a lot of things in our lives, including with our intimate relations, some of which are very intimate, but the one thing we all close the door for is to go use the bathroom. And yep. That's when I start to just get, that's when the limit of my imagination starts to fail me. When I think about what my uncle went through and what other people going through this, like, this is not something they can hide. This is not something they can pretend like everybody else does. Like, I was a big fan of like Star Trek when I was growing up. There are no toilets on the Enterprise. On the TV show 24, where you get like every minute of like, Kiefer Sutherland's day, he never stops and goes to the bathroom. It's like this weird thing. We all do it. To quote the great children's book, Everybody Poops, but we never talk about it. Yep. Because that's just not something anybody wants to deal with. It's weird. I think it has to do with the fact that, it's just, it kind of reminds us that we're not as special as we think, we humans, that we're all animals. And that's a thing that in a lot of areas bothers people on a deep psychological level. It's undignified, it's weird. Who knows? Now I'm getting way off base. All I mean to say is important. There's a psychological barrier or hurdle that people like my uncle and other patients have to go through on a daily basis, that it's just hard for someone like me, who have my own problems, to really appreciate.
Yeah, and everything you're saying, Peter, is so right and so smart, and we are so very aware of it, because we think the stigma attached to these diseases actually creates worse outcomes for our patients. And our patients suffer and struggle more because of this stigma, because they're not bringing it to the attention of their loved ones early enough. They're not even willing oftentimes to talk to their own doctors about it. And the reality is that diarrhea and urgency for bowel movements and frequency of bowel movements is a very common symptom of the disease. And so it's present for many of our patients.
Right.
And it gets in the way.
And I just can't imagine what it's like for people who deal with all the stuff that all humans have to deal with, insecurities, et cetera. And then on top of that, this. Yep. And that's why I feel sorry for my uncle. I feel proud of him for ultimately getting over it and having a life, including intimate relationships. And that's, why, frankly, I'm talking to you today, because I hope that my uncle's bequest to you helps, if it were to help directly or indirectly one other person deal with that in a way that he struggled with, and to make it easier for them, then I would think that would be a wonderful memorial to him.
Yeah, I often say that our ability to serve every IBD patient in the country, and our ability to find cures for these diseases is it's not an if situation, it's a when situation. And it really is a matter of time and money. And the more money we have, the faster we will get to that solution, to all those solutions. So it is not a stretch at all to say that your uncle's bequest will absolutely be able to help patients, because it will allow us to provide more education. It will allow us to provide more emotional support in the moment. It will help fund additional research that maybe 3 or 5 or 7 years from now will lead to an important discovery and development. And so it's very tangible way to help improve people's lives. And
Well,
we feel
I
so
should ask you, I should ask you, other than getting surprise bequests from people you've never heard of, how do you folks raise money? Who do you rely on to fund your operations?
Yeah, we definitely do it in a lot of ways. So the first thing I would say is that we are a national organization. We are headquartered in New York, but we have 35 chapters all across the country, and we cover all 50 of the United States. And each of those chapters is conducting fundraising activities in those respective communities. We host fundraising events. So we have a series of galas and luncheons and golf tournaments that are raising money. We also have a national walk program called Take Steps. And in almost 100 communities across the country, every spring and fall, we host walks. We have endurance events through a program called Team Challenge, where people run half marathons or hike the Grand Canyon or do a triathlon, all to raise money for the organization. And we certainly accept direct gifts online of all sizes. We have some nice corporate relationships that bring resource to the organization. And we certainly have planned gifts and bequests like Ted's. We now actually have a resource and a relationship with Free Will. And for anyone who's interested, you can go to our website, Crohn's Colitis Foundation.org/freewill to understand how you too could make a bequest to the organization. So we have a very diverse revenue pool, and it's important for us to raise money in a variety of ways. So we do.
Okay, that's great. Well, I hope that my uncle's surprise request, huzzah, helps you continue that work. And I'm very happy. You know, again, it's odd both for my brothers and myself to think back upon our relationship with him, and we were so glad that we had that relationship, which I think is rare to have an uncle to whom that you're that close and that beloved. But it also makes me sad that despite that, he didn't feel he could share that with us, because we would have been supportive in the way that we were. We loved him a lot. So I'm kind of glad that just by participating in this conversation with you and maybe other things I can do, I can help him after the fact, if you will.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. And I hope, and I suspect the rest of your family members are feeling proud of him and this incredible act of generosity and the things that it can make possible. So we're grateful to you all for your support of him in all the ways that you did during his life, and for helping to continue to spread the word.
Well, I'm grateful that you guys exist, that he had a place to, frankly, reach out to let him make this money do some good work.
So much of what you just shared is going to be helpful to so many IBD patients and caregivers across the country. Thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure, I guess. And more to the point, it's kind of a privilege for me to be in a position where, mainly thanks to my uncle's generosity, I'm able to do a little bit to spread awareness of what he dealt with and maybe help some people who are dealing with it now. So I really feel fortunate to be able to do that. So thank you.